Kia ora, everyone. And firstly, thank you for joining us on this lunchtime session. I know lunchtime is valuable. So we're going to hear a presentation from Natasha, Dr. Natasha Carpenter on shoreline adaptation planning. So Auckland Council is in the process of developing its first Shoreline Adaptation Work Programme, or SAP, as we refer to them as, which is a key body of work towards implementing Te Tāruke-ā-Tāwhiri, that's Auckland's climate plan. The programme will develop a holistic and a sustainable long-term plan in response to potential impacts of coastal hazards such as erosion, inundation, flooding, and how the risk associated with those hazards might change over time. So this presentation will outline the approach that we've adopted at Auckland Council to develop the Shoreline Adaptation Plan and how that aligns with national and international policy and best practice. I think it's fair to say we've learned quite a lot from the initial phases of the work, and we'll hear from Natasha about challenges we've overcome along the way and how we plan to implement the shoreline adaptation plans to create a more resilient coast for future generations. Just a little bit about Natasha. Natasha's currently a coastal management practice lead at Auckland Council, providing guidance on coastal hazards, climate change adaptation, coastal processes, and engineering matters. She obtained her PhD from the University of Southampton in the UK, studying the impacts of sea level rise on soft cliff recession processes, and has around 15 years of experience spanning globally across academia, consultancy, and the public sector. So without too much more from me, I'll hand over to Natasha to present. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much for your time this lunchtime. It's great to see so many people online today, and yeah, thanks again, John, for the introduction. So today I'd really like to speak to our Shoreline Adaptation Plan Work Programme for Auckland. I'm representing the project team as project sponsor for this piece of work. Just a little acknowledgement for Tonkin and Taylor and Mitchell Daish as our partners on delivering this work programme, along with our broader internal project team and Manawhana engagement, and I'll be touching on all of those points in more detail through the presentation as well. So just a little bit of an outline to what I'll be talking about today. I'll provide a little bit of context to the Auckland region for those of you that may not be so familiar with our coastline and some of the coastal management challenges here. Secondly, I will speak to some of the national and regional policy framework that the Shoreline Adaptation Plan Work Programme is aligned to. And thirdly, I will focus on what is actually within the scope of our Shoreline Adaptation Plan Work Programme. There's a number of different adaptation plans being developed across New Zealand, and each one is slightly different, so I'll speak to some of our scope. Fourthly, I will outline some of the process that we're taking towards developing each of these plans. And then I will penultimately just provide a bit of a case study example for our first completed shoreline adaptation plan for the Whangaparāoa Peninsula, and just close out with some conclusions and next steps in terms of the implementation and some of the lessons learned. So just to start with some of the context to Auckland. So Auckland has the highest population density to coastline ratio in New Zealand. We've got about 3,200 kilometres of coastline, and includes the three major harbours of the Kaipara, the Waitemata, and the Manukau Harbour, and all our Hauraki Gulf Islands. So we're blessed with a really diverse and dynamic coastline, and that includes our high energy open west coast volcanic sand beaches such as Muriwai and Piha. We've got our sort of more golden sand, broad dune buffered beaches up on the northeastern coast such as Te Aire and Pakiri. We have our more inner city urban beaches that are quite highly managed with lots of beach replenishment and coastal management structures such as Mission Bay or even Orewa. And then we also have a broad network of inland waterways, so lots of intertidal areas, popular for boating, lots of mangrove development. So there's a lot of coastline to think about, and everyone that knows about coastal processes will know that there's quite unique management to consider of each of these different environments. And so that brings with it a lot of here and now coastal management challenges that Auckland Council we're grappling with every day and responding to. So that includes exposure to a number of different coastal hazards, so coastal inundation, that raise in water level that creates temporary flooding impacts as a result of storm surge or wave setup, coastal erosion of both our cliffs and our beaches, either as a gradual ongoing process or more episodic cliff erosion events. And some of the interface of those coastal processes with rainfall flooding as well, where it discharges at the coast. Auckland has quite a modified coastline, so extensive reclamation, lots of legacy coastal structures, both private and public, to think about for the management. And quite a developed coast as well. So some of that legacy development pressure, and then also the sort of ongoing development pressure that we have as land is sort of a scarce commodity in Auckland, and finding suitable land to develop on even less so. And then in terms of ongoing and future coastal management challenges, first and foremost, climate change impacts, which is really at the forefront of a lot of people's minds at the moment. So including some of our sea level rise impacts, and I've included here the latest figure from the NZ Sea Rise report, just an example where they've included some of the projections contextualised for New Zealand for how the IPCC 6 results align for New Zealand under those range of different climate change scenarios that we have. And you can see there that we've got a broad range to be thinking about, but whatever you look at, the trend is generally going up to some degree, and we need to be able to plan for it, adapting and responding to those impacts. We've also got the interface with increased seasonal rainfall, and together those two driving factors are ultimately increasing the frequency and magnitude of some of those coastal hazards. So we know that our 1 in 100 year coastal storm surge event is likely to become a lot more frequent as sea level rises over time. So what was a temporary nuisance event will become more and more something that people are getting affected by in their day-to-day lives. We have a range of coastal hazards mapping available for Auckland Council that really demonstrates some of these impacts quite well. So here's an example of some of our coastal inundation mapping for Auckland, looking at the 1% AEP with 1 metre of sea level rise, and what we might get in terms of some of those inundation extents into the future. And we also have a regional areas susceptible to coastal erosion and instability study that again shows how through those different time horizons combined with sea level rise impacts, we're going to see those changing retreat levels over time and how we need to plan for those. Ongoing coastal management challenges takes 2 slides. So just to round that off, some of the other things that we need to consider is really in the asset management space, both the private and public structures. So with all of those increasing pressures from climate change and coastal processes, we're going to see a reduced performance of some of our infrastructure that wasn't originally designed for the types of events that are coming, or as infrastructure just comes towards the end of its design life. And that brings with it increased maintenance costs or increased renewal costs that we need to plan for. And also think about whether we need to retain that status quo management approach, or whether that's where we start to plan to accommodate coastal processes in a different way. So ultimately, it's really around that sustainable management and how we balance the various cultural, environmental and social values and those intangible values of our coast, which are very high, against also some of the economic feasibility of coastal management solutions going forward. So for 3,200 kilometres of coast, we know that it's not going to be possible to protect everywhere in the same way. So we need to have a really robust plan in place for that. That was a little bit of context to the Auckland region, and now I'm just going to zoom up from that a little bit into the national and regional framework that we are working towards in local government and giving effect to. So obviously in New Zealand, we've got a broad range of policies and guidance documents to help us with our day jobs. And I'm not going to speak to the Resource Management Act and the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. I think that a lot of people are well familiar with the context that's provided at that high level. But I'm just going to speak to three main documents that have come out underneath that. First being the Coastal Management Framework for the Auckland region. We published this document for Auckland Council in 2017, really recognising the need for a more consistent approach to coastal management for Auckland post the amalgamation back in 2010. And we set out within that a series of coastal management principles that well align with what you see in the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement and the RMA. So really around taking a holistic systems-based approach to our coast so that we start to appreciate that anything that we do, we need to be mindful of any potential impacts that it will have on the adjacent sections of the coast and really tailor those solutions. Considering at least a 100-year time frame, directly aligns with the NZCPS approach on coastal hazards, and starting to move towards the consideration of time or event-dependent options. So really what we're thinking about there is recognising that we can't always be continuing on with that status quo. We need to think about where those trigger points might be for changing management solutions and how we can work those into a plan over time. Embedding climate change into our approach, and finally developing appropriate technical solutions. So again, really focusing on the coastal environment and what works best within that given coastal cell or coastal stretch, and making sure that those solutions are tailored appropriately. And then the other thing that we did within the Coastal Management Framework is a big document. It's a big gap analysis as well as a think piece. It highlights a series of tools for coastal management going forward. That includes some of our regional coastal hazards data, which is now quite well complete, as I alluded to on my previous slide. Some of our community education and awareness around those coastal hazards and coastal processes, and our shoreline adaptation plans, which back when we were drafting this document, we actually called them coastal compartment management plans. We've just refined that terminology now just to make the scope a little bit clearer as to what they cover and make sure that there's no confusion with what we have within the RMA coastal planning space. And so that was really our first sort of peg in the sand really as to where we wanted to head with our shoreline adaptation plans. The same year of 2017, we also had, of course, the Ministry for the Environment, Coastal Hazards and Climate Change guidance was published later that year. And that included the sea level rise figures then based on the IPCC 5. So provided some recommendations there for local government to consider and start building into their planning horizons. And it also sort of reinforced one of the concepts of dynamic adaptive pathways that fitted quite well with what we had within the principles of the coastal management framework. So not just looking at the traditional UK approach of time dependent short, medium and long term strategies and how they might change, but also where those trigger points might be and how those range of solutions might change those pathways depending on what actually eventuates physically within your system. So that's a way of building in for some of that uncertainty and also allowing for some flexibility for coastal management practitioners, which a lot of local governments have been working on implementing since this guidance came about. And finally, we had the Auckland Climate Plan, which was published in 2020. And this really recognised the coastal compartment management plans, shoreline adaptation plans as a key priority area within the communities and coasts chapter. And that included some action areas around the resilience to our people and places and building in for our changing coastlines. So we are effectively a key part of implementing Auckland's climate plan, and it's great to be recognised through that as an umbrella document. as well as working within the Te Ora o Taumaki Makaurau Wellbeing Framework, which provides us with that Mātauranga Māori wellbeing framework within which to work the shoreline adaptation plans alongside. So just to sort of summarise that, really, that the shoreline adaptation plans are at the bottom of an umbrella of a broad range of different legislation and policy documents and best practice guidance for New Zealand, from the RMA all the way down to what we have in the Ministry for the Environment, Coastal Hazards and Climate Change guidance. So what are shoreline adaptation plans? So shoreline adaptation plans for Auckland are really plans to inform the long-term management of council-owned land and assets on the coast, and taking into account the impacts of those coastal hazards that I've already mentioned, so coastal erosion, coastal inundation, rainfall and catchment flooding, and the impacts of climate change, so particularly how those impacts of climate change are likely to change some of those coastal hazard profiles over time. And working alongside that technical piece, it's around understanding the values of the local community and working in the spirit of partnership with mana whenua to identify those appropriate high-level coastal management strategies that can be taken through into the more detailed implementation of coastal management responses for Auckland going forward. So just to unpack that statement around council-owned land and assets a little bit more, what we're really focusing on here for council land is all public beaches, our esplanade reserves, our regional and local parks on or near the coast. So within Auckland, I think we have around 28 regional parks, and the majority of those are all on the coast. So they're a real asset to the Auckland region and a high priority area for us to manage sustainably going forward. And the coastal assets, we're talking about both coast protection structures such as our seawalls and rock revetments, as well as coastal amenity structures, including our big boat ramps, our coastal accessways, our wharves and jetties, and also our community facilities assets. So any of those toilet blocks, playgrounds, sports fields that are all located on the coast within that council-owned land, the coastal walkways, so that we're managing all of these areas coherently and holistically. And the adaptation strategies that we're setting through the shoreline adaptation plans are based on 4 high-level strategies, and I'll speak to each one of these a little bit more. So we have first our no active intervention, going from sort of a lowest level of intervention all the way up to our highest. So, no active intervention is really where we've got a highly natural environment already, we've got sufficient space, we don't want to interfere, and so there's very minimal to no human intervention really with those natural processes. So this is a policy approach that we particularly implement around our regional parks, where we just really want that natural system to continue managing itself. Limited intervention is really around maintaining the existing assets. So here we're looking at how we can use nature-based interventions to support the existing system. So that's where our dune planting comes into play. Some of our sand push-ups that we might do to increase the dry high tide beach area from the intertidal area. But again, it's quite light touch, and it's really around just helping that system along, but allowing it to maintain itself naturally as much as possible. Hold the line is a much more man-made response. So this is really where we're defending the current coastline as it is from coastal erosion or coastal inundation processes. So traditionally that's through our hard protection structures such as seawalls and rock revetments, and moving a little bit more currently into hybrid solutions or building in nature-based components to that work. So we're seeing a lot more groins with beach replenishment, for example, in that mix, mudcrete structures. So where we can build more nature-based solutions within that hold the line approach, there's a preference towards that. And finally, managed realignment. So this is really a strategy for when we've got a high risk area or an area where we've got sufficient space to move assets or infrastructure back to make space for those coastal processes to be accommodated and for the system to function more naturally. So allowing the beach, which we know is a lot more resilient in the long term to coastal storm events and changing water levels and hard defences that require constant maintenance and renewal commitments and can also have negative impacts on that coastal system. So those are our 4 high-level adaptation strategies that we're ultimately seeking to map out for all of our coast in the short, medium and long term. So how are these plans developed for Auckland? The Shoreline Adaptation Plan Work Programme as a whole has a number of different work streams. So we have a technical work stream, which is where we're really looking in detail at those coastal processes, the coastal assets and what the coastal hazard risk profile looks like. We have an extensive community engagement component to work with communities to understand the values of the coast and how we can transform those into objectives that can be used to guide those adaptation strategies. Then there's obviously a big piece with stakeholder liaison with our asset owners and infrastructure providers to make sure that any high-level strategies that are recommended align and have been fed into by the relevant parties, including CCOs such as Auckland Transport and Watercare, as well as within council, community facilities and park sport and recreation. And then there's the political engagement just to get the final endorsement and approval of the plan. So working directly with the local boards of the given area that we're focusing on, and then scaling up to the governing body through the Environment and Climate Change Committee. And then finally, but by no means last, the part that wraps all this together and that goes on throughout the entire process of developing each of these plans is the Manawhenua engagement. And so we complete Manawhenua engagement at 3 different tiers, which I can speak to in a little bit more detail here. So shoreline adaptation plans are designed in the spirit of partnership with Manawhenua. Within Auckland Council, we have the Infrastructure and Environmental Services Kaitiaki Forum, and we've been working with that forum since the conception of the shoreline adaptation plans, and they've developed for us some guiding principles for all shoreline adaptation plans to work towards at their highest level. And you can see some of those principles listed here, including being responsive to iwi management plans, a preference towards naturalising and letting nature take its course where it's practicable, and protecting cultural and heritage values. And then within each SAP area, so that those principles are designed at the regional level, and then within each SAP area, we work directly with the local iwi that have an interest or rohi in that area, and they're engaged to work with us through that entire process of developing the shoreline adaptation plan so that we can really understand the cultural values of the coast, and they can build in to the adaptation strategies what they would like to see and their experience from Mātauranga Māori as to how the coast is evolving over time and appropriate solutions. And then finally, we do work with the governance forum as well as doing that political engagement piece, work with the iwi governance forum as well, just to get the final endorsement of these plans developed. Under the technical work stream, as I said, there's a number of different stages to this. So the first is really that understanding of the coast, so gathering all of that background information to make sure that we're really across what's happening in the coastal zone that we're looking at. So that includes the coastal geomorphology of the given area, breaking down our coast into more discrete, geomorphically independent coastal cells, and so that any high-level strategies that we identify are not going to have any negative or unintended impacts on adjacent cells, understanding our coastal processes, and also understanding the key features and assets that we have along that coast from our Auckland Council and CCO perspective. Then we have that understanding of the issues as the second piece of the puzzle. So understanding the coastal hazards exposure based on our current coastal inundation, coastal erosion and catchment flooding mapping that we have available for each of these areas. And also understanding the existing condition of our coastal assets, particularly those that provide a coastal protection function. And then finally wrapping all of this together to understand the risk profile of our coast and how that changes over time. So really understanding the likelihood, consequences and vulnerability of events, and to identify those higher risk areas, and that will in turn influence some of those high level coastal management strategies that are recommended in the final Shoreline Adaptation Plan. The community engagement, this is really focused on understanding what Aucklanders value. So we really want to understand how communities engage with the coast, whether that's through just hanging out at the beach, or the boating is a really key sort of amenity value to the area, and what areas are significant to the community for either their well-being, their heritage values or their cultural values, so that we can start to develop some objectives that fit and are unique to the coastal management area that we're looking at for the Shoreline Adaptation Plan. So essentially the adaptive strategies need to understand these values so that we can develop really clear objectives to make good decisions. And we develop those objectives not just with the community, but also working with Whenua, the technical experts and the infrastructure providers to make sure that we've got something really coherent. And if you go back to the Ministry for the Environment, Coastal Hazards and Climate Change guidance, this is really sort of focused on that point 3.4 around what matters most in that coast, and how we can build that into our adaptation strategies. So essentially what we're really looking at is for low impact areas moving more into our no active intervention as a preferred response. And then as we move into sort of areas that are of higher risk, or where we've got very high values of that coast, that's where we're looking at some of those more managed intervention strategies, such as hold the line or managed realignment. And in general, linking back through to the Whenua principles, there's a preference for natural nature-based options to implement those strategies where practicable. And we're also mindful through the looking out towards the implementation of the shoreline adaptation plans that the cost to implement is another reason for focusing on those nature-based and no active intervention strategies, which are typically of a lower cost than the hold the line when you're looking at both the consenting, the construction, and then the maintenance costs over time. Also recognising that managed realignment does typically have quite a high cost to implement or get it underway before the natural system can take over. So we're really mindful of all of those components as well when we're setting out these strategies. So now I'm just going to give you an example for our first shoreline adaptation plan that was developed for the Whangaparāoa Peninsula. So the Whangaparāoa Peninsula is located on the northeast coast of Auckland, and we selected this area really because of its variety of coastal environments. So we've got a good mix there of coastal beaches and coastal cliff environments, a range of council-owned lands and assets, including Shakespeare Regional Park out at the tip of the peninsula there. And within the coastal management framework, we had a series of coastal hotspots identified for Whangaparāoa. So it was an area that had some discrete sites that were always sort of frequently recurring whenever we had coastal storm impacts. So it was a good area to trial the process out. And the plan is being developed in partnership with Ngāti Manahiri and Ngāi Tāmaki. And yeah, an example of that technical assessment piece. So we start with our coastal hazards assessment to understand on the top there. It's a bit difficult to see at this scale, but that's our coastal erosion mapping for the peninsula. Then our coastal inundation extents for that 1% AEP plus 1 metre sea level rise. And then our catchment flooding component. And for Whangaparāoa Peninsula, that was really translated into more of an exposure assessment to look at the impacts in the short, medium and long term across our parks and reserves land, our council infrastructure, our environmental values and the cultural and ecological archaeological sites, just to understand any changing risk over time as a result of that exposure to coastal hazards. The community engagement piece for the Whangaparāoa Shoreline Adaptation Plan included a range of different methods. So we had digital engagement through the Auckland Council AK Have Your Say website, and that also included social pinpoint, which you can see an example of up in the corner there. So it's essentially an interactive map that people can log on to. They can add pinpoints, they can provide comments on any areas that they would like to sort of let us know about, what they value in the area, what parks or beaches they use. And that's what we use to sort of form some of our objectives. And we also had a series of in-person engagement events, so 3 public presentations to explain coastal hazards and what the Shoreline Adaptation Plan Work Programme was about. 2 open days that sort of bookended the engagement period at the beginning and the end of the consultation. And we also established a community reference group, so a focused collection of about 12 individuals that we workshopped directly with some of those concepts of the values of the area and what those community objectives were shaping up like as a result of taking all of that information from each of those different engagement tools and collating it together. So ultimately, the Whangaparāoa Pilot report, what it looks like is that the coastline has been broken down into about 35 discrete coastal stretches. And for each of those coastal stretches, we've identified adaptation strategies across the short, medium and long term. And you can see an example of that down below for Red Beach and how those changing colours representing those changing management strategies over time. And then within the main body of the report, each coastal stretch is discussed in detail, which provides you with a little bit more context as to both the specific area that you're looking at and also some of the rationale behind any of those selected high-level management strategies or how they might change over time, both the context to the public and also for coastal asset managers for what we're thinking about in those areas. What we found with Whangaparāoa, as a whole, the peninsula is generally managed quite well over the next 100 years with little to no active intervention. There are limited areas where we're looking at more active intervention, and those coastal stretches where we've got that hold the line, which you can see with the purple marks on the map, we really have a strong link to where we've got critical infrastructure such as roading that has no capacity to be moved landward, or we have a very high amenity value, and they're generally in areas where a suitable managed realignment response would be constrained. The final Whangaparāoa Shoreline Adaptation Plan, just to speak a little bit to the political engagement, we worked with the Hibiscus and Bays local board throughout the development period, and they were really pivotal in some of the public presentations and engagement events that we held, and it was taken for final endorsement at the Hibiscus and Bays business meeting in February. It was also presented to Te Pōtaio for the Mana Whenua governance level engagement in March, before being taken to the Environment and Climate Change Committee also in March for final approval. So Mātauranga Māori from Ngāti Manahiri and Ngāi Ki Tāmaki is a core foundation of the report, and you can see that woven in throughout the report, particularly around the values and the coastal management principles that have been adopted. And you can find a copy of this report. It's available online on both the Auckland Council website and through the Auckland Design Manual. Some of the lessons learnt through this process, I think first and foremost, probably the most important one, is you need to allow sufficient time for mana whenua and community and stakeholder engagement. So we found that there was quite an extensive process to communicate the coastal hazards information, to understand the values of the coast and what the scope of the shoreline adaptation plans cover. And that's a process that you need to build in that to your project plans to make sure you've got sufficient time for that. And also there's always benefit in providing a bit of extra contingency there, because it's a process that you have a little bit less control over how it's going to pan out. The importance of utilising a range of different engagement methods we found was really important. So that mix of digital online engagements, in-person engagements where possible was really important. Obviously, over the last couple of years, that's been a little bit of a moving feast with COVID, but yeah, we have found that the in-person engagement events directly linked to an uptake in our digital engagement platforms. So they are really beneficial if you can get out there. And using a range of different tools. So we've had online surveys, social pinpoint, which has been really helpful for us to look at where people are commenting on and what their values are and to take forward. And the value of the risk assessment results. So as I touched on for Whangaparāoa, that was more based on an exposure assessment. For our next tranche of shoreline adaptation plans, we've been more focusing on a more detailed semi-quantitative risk assessment. And that's quite important in terms of being able to provide some more direct links through to your decision making and how you prioritise areas based on risk. So just to conclude, for Auckland as a whole, it's you know, as I said, we've got a big coastline to work across, 3,200 kilometres of coast. So we're anticipating it will take us 3 to 5 years to complete the entire coastline. To date, we've completed the Whangaparāoa Pilot. We are nearing the end of the Beachlands and East Shoreline Adaptation Plan, which covers our coast from Pine Harbour over in Beachlands through to the Auckland Regional Council boundary over on the southeast coast. We are also just nearing completion of a mini shoreline adaptation plan focused on just one discrete area at Little Shoal Bay, but applying the same principles of the shoreline adaptation plan development framework, but just to a more discrete area. And we are about to launch our next 2 shoreline adaptation plans next month for the Southern Manukau and Whitu Peninsula. So we're really starting to scale up the programme now that we have a couple of pilots under our belt, and we'll be running these next 2 plans in parallel at the same time. So that will be another sort of learning process for us. And as we're workshopping through those, we'll also be working with Whenua and the results of a regional coastal hazards risk assessment. So we've been developing the coastal hazard risk assessment for Beachlands and East just to get that methodology underway. We'll be scaling that up across the region and using the results from that to prioritise our coast in terms of how we roll out the rest of our shoreline adaptation plans across the region with Whenua in the sort of coming months. In terms of implementation, that's really critical for the shoreline adaptation plans. So we've had a really broad coastal and council teams that have been involved in the development of the shoreline adaptation plans. And that implementation similarly is a bit of a collaborative approach across the Auckland Council departments, including community facilities, parks, sports and recreation, and healthy waters, water care and Auckland Transport. So essentially all of the recommendations from the Shoreline Adaptation Plan will be woven into a range of other council documents, including our reserve management plans, our open space management plans, regional parks management plans and asset management plans, just to name a few. So we'll be reinforcing some of those high-level recommendations of the SAPs, which are essentially non-statutory documents, but weaving those through into our portfolio of other plans and documents to reinforce the messaging there. And one of the really key parts of this going forward is the recommended strategies will be used to develop our coastal asset management plan for all of our coastal structures. And that's really where the implementation in terms of what those high-level strategies transform to when we're looking at specific assets and what's appropriate under each of those high-level strategies is really important. And overall, this will help us to develop a regional prioritisation process for future funding. So at the moment, there's a lot of questions as to how climate change impacts are going to be funded, making sure that we have the right revenue available. So this information is all going to help to resolve that process and to paint a clearer picture over time. Just to conclude, through the shoreline adaptation plans, we really know that our coast is changing, but we do have some time to plan and adapt, but we do need to start now. So one thing when we began this process, and the need for it was recognising that if there's already a coastal structure that is in need of repair, and that there is a high community interest, that you've sort of missed your chance, you need that high level strategy in place before you start that process, so that you can articulate that clear plan going forward, without the pressure of what's going to happen in the here and now. And we've really found that shoreline adaptation plans are an effective tool to support that sustainable long-term management of our coast. So how do we best balance out those nature-based solutions with more of the hold-the-line approaches? And for Auckland Council, we feel that we've taken a really novel approach to engaging with communities to really understand their specific values to each discrete section of coast that we're working on, and use that information to develop a plan that best reflects that community and what we should be doing there, taking on board the community insights as to how they've seen that coast change over time into our adaptation strategies, for example. And finally, just reinforcing that those risk-based assessments have been really useful for us to underpin the decision-making that we have set at those high-level strategies. And that's really all from me. I just wanted to close out with some final acknowledgements. So to our local iwi partners, including Ngāi Taiki Tāmaki, Ngāti Manahiri, Ngāti Whanonga, Te Āketai, Ngāti Whātua Ōraki and Ngāti Paoa, who have all been involved in some of the shoreline adaptation plans at a local iwi level, as well as through the IES Kaitiaki Forum as a whole, for the Shoreline Adaptation Plan Work Programme. Our Auckland Council project team, which includes all of Resilient Lands and Coasts, and the Healthy Waters Unit, our citizen engagement team, community facilities and park, sport and recreation, and Auckland Emergency Management, to name just a few there. Our council-controlled organisations for water care and Auckland Transport have been working in partnership with us on these plans. And also just to re-acknowledge Tonkin and Taylor and Mitchell Daish, who have been really helpful, particularly in the technical work piece and the engagement piece of developing each of the shoreline adaptation plans. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back over to John for any questions.
So thanks, Natasha. That's a great presentation and incredibly succinct. I'm at least aware of the massive amount of work that's gone into the whole process, and certainly the first plan. So thank you. So we've got a few questions coming in. What I might try and do, there's a few with a similar theme that I might try and wrap together. So there's a question, Natasha, around within the shoreline adaptation plans, what's the approach to an increasingly squeezed esplanade reserve or coastal strip?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I suppose I sort of alluded to that we're mindful that with managed realignment processes, you need space to accommodate if you're going to do that well and do that properly. And also, I think one thing that's really important here is understanding the values of the coast. So our approach at the moment would be quite different for a squeezed section of an esplanade reserve. That maybe actually it's a dry high tide beach area, for example, that's getting more of the use than an area where maybe you've got a very prominent coastal walkway that's getting high use and is the only access to and along that section of coast. So that's where those community values are really important, as well as both understanding the coastal processes and what's practicable there.
Okay, thank you. Hope that answers the question. So another one, more technical one, actually. How much of Auckland's coastline and management cells already have hydrodynamic models to inform decisions?
So in terms of catchment models, so that's where we work with Healthy Waters. So they provide for the coastal cell that we're looking at, they provide that information from their best available current catchment flood models that are available. And then for the coastal data, we've got regional coastal inundation modelling available for the whole of the Auckland region. Not everywhere is covered hydrodynamically. So we've got bathtub modelling for the whole of the coastal area, and then we have hydrodynamic models for some of those more complex flood systems such as the Kaipara River. So there's a little bit of a mix there, which is a bit difficult to summarise.
Okay, I might just follow that one up. There was another similar question around water modelling. You mentioned at the start the need to assess river/estuary effects on coastal processes. Has any, I know there's only one SAP been done, but has any SAP been done on river effects on coastal processes, particularly in high rainfall areas such as Matakana, Gleneden rivers leading into the Kowau Bay?
Yeah, so not as yet. The main area that we've had at the moment is the stretch of the Wairoa River that's included around Clevedon within the Beachlands and East Shoreline Adaptation Plan. But we are yet to move into an area that's sort of as a whole characterised by that interaction between those processes. So I'm anticipating that when we do get to the Kaipara River, for example, and some of those more estuarine environments, so that's going to be a real focus. So it's been quite good. One of the main benefits for Whangaparāoa Peninsula was to start with quite a small scale area and with quite easy to understand sort of coastal processes in terms of coastal inundation and coastal erosion. And we're sort of building in the complexity as we work our way through the work programme. So we wanted to make sure that we had a really good template before we started scaling up both the delivery programme and some of those more complex issues to be taking on board within the delivery.
Cool, thank you. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't answer some questions around private property. So apologies for putting you on the spot, Natasha, but there's quite a few questions around this, obviously, and understandably. What attempts are we likely to make to mitigate effects on private land along the coast?
So under the RMA, Council has no legal requirement to protect private land from any effects of coastal hazards. So it's really quite complex, and one thing that we've been waiting for, and with the focus of the plans currently being on council-owned lands and assets at the moment, is for the Climate Change Adaptation Act. So there's a lot of signals at the moment for what will be happening in the managed retreat policy and the Climate Change Adaptation Act space, but we're yet to get that clarity from the central government. So that's why we're starting really with the council-owned land. So at the moment, we don't have a responsibility to that unless there's any specific encumbrances or something, which is more on a site-specific basis. Yeah, so we're really focused on the Esplanade reserves and the council land at the moment.
Okay, and similarly, a sort of follow-up, and it's not really our, or rather your realm. I'm aware of that at least, but where retreat is necessary, do we work to address future zoning for these areas, i.e. preventing properties from being developed, perhaps?
So we do, within the Shoreline Adaptation Plan team, we do have representation from plans and places. So we're working alongside plans and places. Obviously the Shoreline Adaptation Plans themselves are non-statutory documents, but they're a critical piece of information in terms of how this might inform some of our future, our next generation of the unitary plan or any future plan changes that we have underway. So that's really the link there.
Cool, thank you. Okay, so we've got a question here. How can or will you use the lessons learned from planning for community assets in the future would you use a similar approach?
Yes, so we did, after the Whangaparāoa Pilot, we completed a second pilot for Beachlands and East, so we're still learning. We're keen to ensure that we continue to through each of the milestones of delivery of each of our sort of next shoreline adaptation plans, but we're constantly refining the approach. So one thing that we had for Whangaparāoa was the community reference group, for example. What we found through that process was that it took quite a lot of time and management to set it up, but that we didn't get a huge amount more information through that process than what we were getting through the wider public engagement events. So for Beachlands and East, we refined the process to just put more emphasis on a mix of in-person and online engagement events that were available to everyone, as opposed to operating another community reference group. We did find we had to shift a number of our engagement events to online portals for the last round with COVID. So again, we're still trying to find that sweet spot, I think, between the digital and in-person engagements will be something that we'll be looking to refine in the future. But yeah, we're quite happy with how it's been going, and the community engagement has been a really important part of both communicating with coastal hazards information and also being able to sense check those objectives and how that feeds through into the strategies.
Great, thank you. Another good one here. Does the SAP pilot or the SAP process generally consider how the adaptation strategies will be funded?
That's where that regional prioritisation piece comes in. So we have a number of things in the here and now that can be used to fund them. So we have our Coastal Renewals Work Programme, we have our Operational Work Programme, but we are also mindful that with climate change and those increased pressures, we need to have that plan in place for how we're going to accommodate that in the future. So that's where the regional prioritisation and funding piece that's going to be completed through the regional risk assessment that's currently underway, and the results of all of those shoreline adaptation plans will become a sort of key piece of work in its own.
Sure, okay. Well, that's us out of questions for the moment, unless anyone wants to add any further. I'll give you 30 seconds or so, hack something in. Okay. How are we thinking about incorporating NZC RISE info into the planning?
Mm-hmm. So at the moment, we're working through the NZC RISE data, and against our own data that we have for sort of more up-to-date data that we have in some instances, and more local scale data. So we're doing that assessment at the moment. Once we've done that, we'll be looking at the appropriate ways of building it in. But essentially, it won't really change anything in the approach. What it would change is some of those timeframes. So it would really be built into those triggers that we have over time for changing management strategies. Is what it would mainly relate to. Would be potentially moving some of those things forward.
Okay, thank you. So I think we'll wrap it up there then. Thank you again, everyone, for spending your precious lunch times, and hopefully this session has been informative, and we've all learned something new. So thanks again, Natasha, and have a great day, everyone.